Hi, welcome to another one of my Zoom lectures. My name is Andrew Gardner. I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, in the USA. And as you can see from the title slide for today, the lecture that I'm going to present today is entitled Journey to Arabia. And as you'll see on the final slide of this presentation, I actually have published a similar article, an article that under the same title several years ago. And let me quickly move forward to the abstract, which I think is my attempt to sort of summarize the terrain of what I hope to cover today. In this presentation, I provide an overview of the key insights and themes from 2 decades of fieldwork devoted to understanding the transnational migration circuits that lead tens of millions of people to employment in the wealthy states of the Arabian Peninsula. The vantage point that I seek to establish is informed by migrants' experiences in the Arab states to which they journey, by their experiences and the households that they often depart in the states from which they come, and the network of actors that connect the two. This work draws on numerous publications, but as I've already noted, much of what is presented here is distilled in the article also entitled Journey to Arabia, published in Anthropology Now in 2017. So by training, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and the methods that I use in my research are those found in the ethnographic toolkit. Ethnography involves immersion in unfamiliar social and cultural worlds. And we anthropologists have long held that crossing these thresholds of difference, we can, in doing so, we can sometimes see aspects of human existence that only outsiders might be able to glean or grasp. By that logic and by that certain truth, for example, foreigners can see aspects of American society and American culture, my home culture, to which I myself might be oblivious. In pursuing this goal via ethnography, anthropologists pursue the increasingly lost art of thinking about and thinking with others' experiences. In the field, we spend lots of time observing other humans, and we learn even more by conducting ethnographic interviews. So I want to start with the product of those methods, one of the many, many life experiences that I've collected in my sustained focus on transnational labor and migration to the Arabian Peninsula. This migration narrative that I'm about to read is one example of many, and it's about a young man that I'll call Benood, although that's neither his real name nor does he appear in any of the pictures that I'm going to put up for us to sort of give you some images of the sort of migrants and men that I'm talking about. But we'll use Benood's detailed life experience as a springboard to some of the summary points that I want to get to in helping you sort of see the terrain of the migration system that I'm seeking to describe. So, in early 2008, Benood made the decision to migrate to the Gulf. His father, recently deceased, had steadily whittled away the family's small fortune with drinking and gambling. More recently, his family had invested heavily in his sister's dowry via a combination of loans and mortgages. As a result, the family faced an economic crisis of spiraling debt. Benood had experience driving large trucks and after contacting a labor broker in a nearby city, he secured a position as a heavy truck driver in Qatar. The debts incurred to this labor broker for the work visa were substantial, but Benood figured that within a year he could pay off the loan and begin to save some money. Benood left Nepal almost immediately. Once he arrived in Qatar, he was taken directly to a labor camp at the far end of the industrial area, a vast grid of heavy industry, light industry, and labor camps located at the periphery of Doha. Conditions at the camp were difficult. 6 men to a room, itinerant electricity, and an insecure water supply were at the top of his list of concerns. For 6 months, Benood drove a water truck to and from various construction sites in and near the city. Then the company's general manager came and told all the drivers that they were using too much diesel. The manager refused to calculate for the fact that the majority of their time on the road was spent in traffic and often at a standstill. The manager began to penalize them by deducting money from their salaries. In protest, the men refused to drive under the imposed circumstances. Once they stopped driving, the company stopped paying the men their monthly salary. These men eventually found their way to the labor court and filed a case. The court case took an enormous amount of time and a substantial investment. At one point, Benood persuaded his roommates to sell their collectively purchased television so he could extract his share for court fees. For 6 months, the men sat at in the camp as their case percolated through the legal system. Finally, many months later, the case was resolved in their favor. Benood would be going home with all of the salary due to him. Good riddance to Qatar, he thought. Before he could depart, however, the general manager of the company, a savvy and vengeful man, filed a countersuit claiming that Benood had misused 10,000 rials worth of diesel. The manager's intention was to punish Benood. With a new case in the court system, Benood would be prevented from returning home to Nepal. For months more, the spurious case against Benood bounced through the court system in Qatar. Meanwhile, the electricity at the labor camp was turned off during the day, so Benood and the other men and the other striking drivers laid about in the stifling heat, awaiting resolution as best they could. After months languishing in the long summer heat, the spurious case was dismissed. Benood was finally going home. He received several thousand rials in back pay, but most of the money went to the various friends and acquaintances who had loaned him money over the many months he went without pay. He boarded the plane home with less than 500 Qatari rials, or about $137 in his pocket, his savings for more than 2 years working in Qatar. So I'd like to, with that migrant narrative finished, I'd like to move on to just some basic and key information about Qatar that I think is going to help, and the Arabian Peninsula that's going to help sort of understand this migration system. So first of all, the Arabian Peninsula and the wealthy states of the GCC on the Arabian Peninsula are the third largest destination for transnational migration after Europe and North America. So the 25 million migrants who reside there are and remain non-citizens. Integration is not expected or encouraged or allowed by the Gulf states. Moreover, the foreign workers outnumber the citizens in the workforces in all 6 of the GCC states. And those states, in order going from north to south, are Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. So not only do foreigners vastly outnumber citizens in the workforces of all 6 of these states, But in several of these destination states, they outnumber citizens altogether, in some cases 9 to 1 in places like Qatar and Abu Dhabi. The largest portion of these migrants come from South Asia, but there are numbers present from other places in the Middle East, from Southeast Asia, from Africa, and from other locations. And so the story that I want to tell sort of starts, and the summary that I want to provide sort of starts in the hinterlands of South Asia. And so this migration system has a geography that relies foremost on migrants from South Asian states, places like Nepal, India, certainly foremost, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, although it also draws migrants from other places. When one peers into the life of these migrants, I have found one of the recurring themes in those lives are really sets of recurring and interlocking crises in the sending states that are often driving this out migration. So these mostly men and sometimes women are departing their homes for work in Qatar or in one of the other Arab Gulf states, typically because of all sorts of crises that are going on in their home. I would also say another sort of key theme that I've come to in my decades of ethnographic work concerning this migration system is that it's oftentimes not an individual making the decision to go, but rather this is certainly best conceived as a household level decision. And as you may know, households in these South Asian countries where many of these migrants come from are typically large and complex households. And then the last thing I would say in terms of the geography of outmigration is that the footprint of this migration system shifts and changes. So over the years, as I return to Arabia, I typically encounter new new nationalities of migrants in the migrant population. So this migration system oftentimes is reaching out and finding new sources of labor to bring to the Gulf states. I think there's also a lot to say about migrant motivations. Why are these migrants making the decision to leave their home and typically their families behind in order to go work for 2 or 4 or many more years in one of the Arab Gulf states? And certainly in the many interviews and ethnographic projects that I've conducted over the years, money and remuneration, salary levels is certainly the most important and the predominant reason that any migrant will typically cite to you, that they receive more pay and have better opportunities to receive better salaries, doing even manual labor in the Gulf states than they would have in many of the countries from which they come. So certainly those financial reasons are certainly and undeniably at the foremost of much of the thinking that migrants are doing. Another way to think about this, though, and something that migrants that I've interviewed and talked with over the years have helped me see, is that it's often opportunity is often what they're chasing by leaving home. And in some ways, I've often phrased this as some of them have said they're looking even for the opportunity to find opportunity, seeing the opportunities at home as so desolate and impoverished that going abroad, even with the hopes that things might eventually work out better than their initial job, nonetheless spurs them on. Another sort of theme, though, that I've heard and thinking about and talking with migrants about their out migration is just this broader notion of accessing the developed world, trying to grab a hold of the world that they've seen and maybe on television or in newscasts, but trying to get from these less developed or underdeveloped countries and get into the action, so to say. And on that note, I would also add that for many migrants, once you get beyond the financial reasons, you can sense that this is a source of adventure or intrepidness or intrepidity, or sometimes escaping the circumstances at home. So those kinds of reasons are often, often eclipsed by the importance of the financial reasons for migrating, but are oftentimes present nonetheless. Um, and again, then, I think before I conclude this section on migrant motivations, I would note that, again, it's often important, even when we're thinking about motivations, to pull us out of our ethnocentric and very individualistic American sort of lens that looks at the individual, and consider the fact that for many of these migrants, that decision to go to the Gulf for work is actually a household level decision. And I've encountered many migrants who say that it was their father who made that decision for them rather than the migrant themselves. So next, I want to move on to how migrants connect to the Gulf migration system. How do they access and make these connections? And certainly, I think it's important to note that this is a complicated transnational system. There are subagents oftentimes at the village level, moneylenders and banks that sometimes get involved at the village level as well. Chain migration, so maybe friends who've returned from the Gulf are helping to put these kinds of complicated packages together. There are labor brokers and recruiting centers, sometimes in nearby cities and sometimes in capital cities. There are various government agencies. And then once they get to the Gulf states, there are sponsors, employers, and all sorts of various other institutions and stakeholders who are a component of this complex transnational migration system. So nearly 10 years ago, we did a large scale, really the first ever large scale survey of low income migrant workers in Qatar. And we found that the average fee, entrance fee is really the right word for this, that migrants and their families pay to get them into this system came to 1,081 US dollars. And that was something we calculated about 10 years ago. And that would be the price that the migrant and his family perhaps pay for this migrant to enter and obtain a 2-year work visa in one of the Arab Gulf states. I'd also note that William Walters, as a political scientist and scholar who studies migration, has really moved from using the term that I'm using, a migration system, years ago, to one where he talks about it in terms of a migration industry. And so to the list of stakeholders that I've already described, he would add things like the bus drivers and airlines and immigration officials and police, this sort of vast and transnational set of overlapping institutions that are all sort of focused on facilitating these kinds of contemporary mobilities that we see in this part of the world and in other parts of the world as well. These pictures give you just a little bit of a glimpse at some of that infrastructure on the sending end of this migration flow. So next, I want to move to the actual physical journey to Arabia. As an ethnographer for many years now, I've been sitting down with migrants and asking them all sorts of questions, and sometimes questions that certainly must seem like stupid questions to them. But one of the things I discovered long ago in interviewing Gulf migrants was I stumbled upon this, but I asked migrants to tell me about if they could recollect what it was like on their first day when they arrived in the Gulf states. And I discovered that that question oftentimes would just open up the floodgates for these detailed sort of descriptions of the kinds of anxieties and the kinds of sights that they encountered on those first days when they're suddenly abroad, their first day in Arabia. So I've heard countless stories about, you know, the details of young men's first plane rides ever in life, of seeing what it was like for the first time to see the Earth from 30,000 feet, the cold airports that they often had long waits in, and sometimes days of being abandoned as they waited to be picked up by their employers or sponsors, the lack of documentation, endless sort of bureaucratic hurdles, and then oftentimes also recollecting their first glimpses of some of the astonishingly modern skyscrapers and urban landscapes that they encounter there, but also their sort of oftentimes their consternation when they see the actual places that they're going to live, typically labor camps, right? And so their frustrations at the stark differences between the cities they glimpse from afar and the labor camps in which they dwell. These images also give you some picture about the actual migration, the planes that go back and forth between the capitals of South Asia and the Gulf states oftentimes are typically full of migrants traveling back and forth in some manner or another. And then, also sometimes domestic workers in this last picture, simply waiting to be picked up by their sponsors and employers. So next I want to turn to what's called the kafala, and it's the Arabic word. Our translation for that is the sponsorship system. And the kafala, or the sponsorship system, is a system that mandates that migrants can only work for the employer who brings them into the country in the first place. So it's really a system that locks migrants to their employers for the duration of their 2-year contract. And so in one way, as I've said before in writing, this system both governs migration and it orchestrates the tens of millions of relations and experiences between the experiences of tens of millions of migrants and the relations between those migrants and their employers. And I think grasping that basic fact, as I've also argued elsewhere in writing, is really key to understanding the extraordinary variability that we see in migrants' experiences. So it's very easy to go to any one of the Gulf states and I could find a dozen migrants relatively easily whose home and family life back at home and relatives have all greatly benefited from their time and their work and their pay, their salary in the Gulf states. At the same time, it would be very easy for me to find 12 migrants whose experiences have been financially and oftentimes personally cataclysmic in terms of these very same relations. And all of that has to do with the fact that in this system, the kafala, so much depends on a single employer and that employer's sort of concerns for the migrants. I would also say that particular components of this migration system have been changing dramatically, and I'm going to return to this subject at the end of this presentation, because I think these changes, the changes to the sponsorship system, are significant enough that portions of what I'm describing at this juncture of the presentation actually will soon be out of date. Another important aspect that I want to cover about migrants' experiences in the Arab Gulf states is their segregation in the urban landscape of the Gulf capitals and Gulf cities. So foremost, there are typically conglomerations of labor camps and planned what are called bachelor cities and other sorts of labor enclaves, all of which are typically located nowadays at the periphery and outskirts of the city. You can see here in this picture, for example, this is one of the dormitory style labor camps, in this case found in the industrial area of Doha, Qatar. And so this would have rooms that are nowadays limited, I think, to 6 workers per room, and with doors to the outside, and then bathrooms and kitchen facilities are typically located elsewhere. Those kinds of things don't happen in the rooms themselves. Nowadays, especially in Qatar, where I'm a city with which I'm the most familiar, there have been all sorts of new enclaves and labor camps that have been built. This is another example of a much newer sort of labor camp meant to house these vast workforces of transnational workers, most of whom, again, come from South Asia, although certainly some men from Southeast Asia and some from Africa as well. Um, And so, in addition to these labor camps, which, as I've said, are typically located at the margins and periphery of the city, there are buses that carry workers back and forth across what I've come to think of as this threshold between the sort of front stage and the backstage of the city. So the migrants both dwell and sometimes work in this kind of offstage or backstage area, but are building all sorts of structures that are in the front stage of the city that's intended for cosmopolitan visitors, tourists, the citizens themselves, and the variety of upper and middle class foreigners who are also employed in the Arab Gulf states. That segregation in the city can take on a much more direct sort of manifestation in things like the segregation you see in the parks and the shopping malls of many of these regions. Many of the shopping malls in Qatar have long instigated what's called a family day on Fridays, which is also notably the one day that most of these low-income labor migrants have off. The family day prevents those single men from entering the shopping mall. And so you see, whether it's at a Starbucks in a family section or family day at the mall or at the parks, you see this kind of more active and purposeful kind of segregation going on quite a bit. And I briefly mentioned that in addition to the legion of low-income transnational workers, laborers, there's also, a middle class and I suppose upper class of foreign migrants who are also at work in the Arab Gulf states. I myself was an example of that, a professor at one of the universities there for several years. And those sorts of foreigners live in places like you see here, compounds and other sorts of dwellings that are specifically configured for this middle and upper class of transnational professionals at work in the Gulf states. So another sort of facet or aspect of that, of the kinds of segregations that I'm speaking to here. And before I move on, I'll briefly note that these topics and this issue of sort of space and place and segregation in the modern cities of Arabia is actually something that I'm researching, thinking, and writing a lot about. And I have a lot more to say about that, and will be other lectures that are directed at that. I don't want to dwell on that topic anymore at this juncture. So the Arabian societies that host this third largest transnational migration population, I want to just speak briefly about that. And certainly here, foremost, you can see some of the really fascinating things about the demography of this migration. So the proportion of migrants is in the darker blue color on the top, and the proportion of citizens is the lighter blue color on the bottom. And so you can see these are dramatically different sort of proportions of citizens to migrant foreigners than we see, for example, in Canada or the United States or any of the European countries. And as you can also see here in some of these places, like Qatar in the United Arab Emirates, here on the far right, citizens are outnumbered almost 10 to 1 by the foreigners who are present there. These statistics are actually a little bit old, and in some places they've changed even more dramatically. But you see quite a notable imbalance in that sense. So another interesting aspect of the demography of the Arab Gulf states, not only do migrants comprise a much larger component of those demographies than typical in other parts of the world, but almost across the board, citizens work entirely in the public sector. So seek public sector employment, to which substantial benefits and the notable sort of safety net that these states provide to their citizens is typically attached to the public sector. And so almost all citizens work in the public sector, leaving the private sector almost entirely to the foreign workers who are present. And then again, I'll just return to the demographic realities, you know, with these vast sort of contingents of foreign workers. Assimilation, I think it's always good, especially for North Americans and Europeans, to remember that assimilation is discouraged, unwelcome, uncommon, and not expected by the migrant workers who come to work there. Now, of course, there is a lot more to say about Arab Gulf states and societies and cultures, but this is really not the place for that. I want to move on and actually move on to my sort of conclusions, because those points that I've made here sort of summarize this arc from the places where migrants come from to the societies that they come to work in on these 2-year labor contracts. That's my sort of basic taxonomy of this migration system. And so on the remainder of these slides, I just want to draw some brief conclusions that I've come to in thinking about this migration system on the other side of the world from where I am for about 2 decades. I think, first of all, I've really come to think of our contemporary era as the era of mobility. And, you know, the kinds of people on the move incorporates political refugees, migrants, diasporas, travelers, tourists, a constellation of others. And they're on the move over a very, very uneven distribution of capital in all of its various forms. And that's just basically, you know, this mobility where everything seems to be on the move is certainly sort of a foundational component of how I understand it. It's perhaps a deep irony that the wealth of the Arab Gulf states is, you know, largely a hydrocarbon and petroleum wealth in many cases, the fuel for the very mobility that I'm sort of speaking to. But I also think it's important to remember that humans are just one of the things that's on the move in this era of mobility. And so some of these pictures kind of point you to some of the other things that are on the move. As a famous historian of anthropology, James Clifford, once noted long ago in 1994, he began to intuit the possibility that migrants and diasporas would begin to, often in some places, begin to outnumber the citizens and indigenous peoples there, and that's certainly the case in the Arab Gulf. And as I've already said, I have a lot more to say about segregation and space and how foreign matter is sort of being managed by these cities, but that's really, again, another presentation. I love this particular picture here, though. This is coming from the airport to one of the labor camps. This was quite a while ago. I think this was 15 years ago, but just a truck full of men's suitcases. So each one of those suitcases belongs to one Another thing that I think it's important to think about is that for 25 million migrants, roughly, transnational migrants present in the Arab Gulf states, this is their encounter with urban modernity. I think, some people in the West, and that would include Europe and North America, like to think of our cities and our constructions as the sort of frontiers of modernity. But that's certainly not the case. And these astonishingly modern cities, which have, in many cases, sprouted in the last decade or two. These are the kinds of urban modernities that millions and millions and millions of South Asians are encountering and accessing for the first time. And, I would just like to always take note of the fact that this is an urban modernity that's really untethered from its original Western roots. And these cities are the sort of beacons in a lot of way of that modernity. I also like to spend a little bit of time in conclusion talking about migrants and community and how they establish and build community. On the one hand, any community that they're able to construct is itinerant and fleeting and temporary and extremely constrained. But the men that I've come to know over 2 decades nonetheless find ways to connect, albeit briefly, sometimes with this life-saving solidarity. And I see this as a testament to both their humanity and to their agency. But as non-citizens, right, this community is always sort of quelled and quashed, and those energies are constrained to remain ephemeral. So the penultimate point that I wanted to visit, I'm phrasing on anthropology and its value. And so perhaps this presentation can at least give you a glimpse of the anthropological tradition, our penchant for firsthand understandings and collecting firsthand observations and data, but also the long-standing commitment to crossing those thresholds of difference with empathy and doing so on a mission of understanding and comprehension. That's, the mission to which I've tried to devote much of my professional career. But with the activist turn on my campus and in my discipline, anthropology, I actually want to differentiate my work from the biases that are inherent and central to the activist paradigm, which sometimes feels hegemonic to me nowadays. My goals have always been to disentangle the complexities of this migration system, and in doing so, to help the Arab receiving states, to help the various sending states, and to help the migrants themselves, to help all of those stakeholders to make better informed decisions, and similarly, to help the various institutions involved to craft better informed policies, right? That feels quite a bit different than some of the activist interests that course through the discipline of anthropology today and the biases therein. Finally, as I noted earlier in the presentation, there's been some significant changes afoot, and this headline is just one example of many that have come out in the past month. In the past months, Qatar, the focus of my research for more than a decade, has announced significant revision of the laws that held the kafala, or the sponsorship system, in place. There is, of course, much to say, much more to say about the nature of the kafala, but at this juncture, I would simply like to commend Qatar for moving forward with significant changes that, in the greater context of the Arab Gulf states, might help instigate policy changes in those neighboring states as well. And there's already been movement in some of those states previous to this. So, in summary, the portion of the migration system that I've described in this presentation, the portion that locks migrants to their employers and sponsors, the very people who profit from their labor, that portion of the migration system is undergoing significant revision, foremost in Qatar, but also in the neighboring states. In Qatar, these changes have been informed by more than a decade of research, much of it conducted by academics like me. We might view Qatar's position at the frontier of these significant changes as the product not of the shrill, pessimistic, activist journalism that clumsily grapples with the inequalities that are so apparent in the wealthy Gulf states of Arabia, but rather as the result of Qatar's sustained interest in learning more about the social relations configured around its vast migrant population, and Qatar's interest in navigating those relations to build a better future for everyone involved. And so that concludes my overview, my journey to Arabia. Please subscribe if these kinds of lectures are interesting to you, and I welcome any comments or critiques that you may have. All right, ciao.